Greetings, class. Tim Atterbury here. I will share with you my double entry logs for each position on exploring the issue: is the distinction between basic and applied research useful? The first author, Nils Roll Hansen, believes yes. However, I'm not entirely convinced from his writings that is, in fact, his belief. The author's purpose is to draw distinctions between basic and applied science. The author, in distinguishing between the two general categories of science, includes examples in which the general categories further. The author concludes his essay with concern for the politicization of science and research. My critical response to this is that the author, in his effort to distinguish the distinctions between basic and applied sciences, in order to convey his support of these distinctions, seems rather to blend basic and applied science and inextricably link the two. The audience. This author is writing to an audience of policymakers such as political office holders and corporate financiers of science. Most science cannot occur without funding, and I think that this is an example of somebody who's trying to take a position to convince others of his position to try to keep funding flowing. The author is clearly directing this essay at an informed audience. Unless this article is excerpted from a larger work, I'm given this impression, for instance, by the use of OECD without explanation. I had to look it up and learned that it stands for Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The context is establishing a context of science in order to encourage the financing of science at all levels of research. The author seems to be reaching out to the public sector as well as the private sector to encourage funding consideration for all science. The author seems to believe that basic science and attention is perhaps perceived as receives less attention and is perhaps perceived as less important. The author frames his argument in a political policy context. I have some typos in here that I'm not sure how to go back and correct. The author intends to distinguish between basic and applied science as a means to ensure that basic science is regarded in political policy on a comparable footing to applied science. The author expresses his views in a political policy context. However, into this argument that by public policy he means funding of science and scientific research. The author is making an effort to convince his reader that basic science has value and cultural implications on par with applied science. Organization and evidence. The author cites previous studies and compartmentalizes his essay based on these studies. The author explains what he describes as traditional conception of applied and basic research. He goes into detail about the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which expands the concept of scientific research to cover all research and development. The author also expounds on the economic evaluation of scientific policy. He cites a paper by Richard Nelson, The Simple Economics of Basic Science. In this paper, and thus reflected in the author's argument, is the economic necessity to pursue basic science with the same vigor as applied science, particularly in relation to the space race following the Russian Sputnik program. The author further exemplifies his assertion that basic and applied sciences should be distinguished one from the other by citing an example of Donald Stokes' Pasteur's Quadrant, Basic Science and Technological Innovation. Finally, the author expresses his concerns with subordinating science to politics. An example he cites in this regard is with the Philip Kitcher example from Science, Truth, and Democracy. In this example, the author describes how Kitcher believes that Kitcher rejects the distinction between science Okay, editor, we'll have to read the text. I lost my quote in PowerPoint. Now for the no side of exploring the issue, is the distinction between basic and applied research useful? This article, RIP, the Basic Applied Research Dichotomy, authored by Venkatesh Narayamurthy, Tolu Odumusi, and Lee Vinsel. The purpose, the description, the authors make, let's see here. The authors make an example-laced argument that distinctions between basic and applied science are trivial and generally unnecessary. The authors make the argument that often in science, research follows development and not necessarily the reverse. My critical analysis is that the purpose of this article, while purporting to hold a view different from the Nils Rolls-Hansen article, actually agrees with my assessment of the previous article. This article illustrates how there is no practical distinction between basic and applied science. Keyword there is practical distinction. Audience, the author is directing this article at public policy and private sector policymakers and financiers of scientific research. The author's use, in my analysis, the author's use of scientific examples, including unabridged scientific language, indicates that the targeted audience would be persons who have a substantial background in science. Context. The authors establish a host of examples which have actual impact on any reader of this article. The examples serve to illustrate their assertions that there is no useful distinction between basic and applied science for purposes of funding and facilitating research. The authors frame their argument in an American context of American political and societal consideration. Thesis. The authors argue that a chronological evaluation of Nobel Prizes awarded in physics from 1956 through 2009, not inclusive, illustrate their assertion that in science, basic science does not always precede applied science, and neither is basic science vague in its pursuits. The authors frame an argument in which they basically say that basic science and applied science are both related, necessary, and indistinguishable as to level of importance. They essentially answer the age-old question of whether the chicken or the egg came first by attesting that it truly does not matter. In some instances, basic science led to discoveries which prompted invention. In other cases, applied science, through invention, led to questions which could only be remedied through basic science. Organization and evidence. The authors cite numerous examples from Nobel Prize awards for physics. The authors cite Nobel Prizes for physics, the language of which goes beyond my level of comprehension. Clearly, though I am not an intended audience for this article, I understand the purpose of the message, even if I don't comprehend the particulars of the science illustrated herein. In the example for the 1956 Nobel Prize for Physics awarded to William Shockley, John Bardeen, and Walter Brattain for their researches on semiconductors and their discovery of the transistor effect. The authors go on in this example to explain that although the Nobel was awarded for the discovery of the transistor effect, the team of Shockley, Bardeen, and Brattain had to invent the bipolar contact transistor to demonstrate it. The research which led to the discovery of the transistor effect, basic science, required an invention, applied science, in order to demonstrate the new discovery, which became a new technology. Fast forward to Klaus von Klitzing's discovery that under certain conditions, voltage across a current-carrying wire increased in uniform steps. Klaus von Klitzing's research built on the transistor research and development conducted by Shockley, Bardeen, and Brattain. This demonstrates the fluidity of basic and applied science research. The language and style used, the authors use plain language in making their arguments, but use very technical language in describing their examples. The authors write in clear language for purposes of expressing their ideas about science, and they reserve the technical language for the examples used as illustration of their argument. Helping to further answer the question of the chicken or the egg is a book contributed to by a group of Japanese scientists and researchers. Hen eggs, their basic and applied science. Chicken and the egg analogy also refers to the basic and applied science. Which is more important? Which comes first necessarily? Neither necessarily comes first. Neither is necessarily more important, in my opinion. This book goes into great detail about the chemical makeup of a hen egg, the life cycle of an egg which becomes a chicken, the fertilized egg, and an egg which becomes a food source, an unfertilized egg. This information alone is basic science. Fascinating and purposeful, this basic science leads to the applied science of extracting chemicals from hen eggs for use in baby formula, farming practices for higher yields, larger eggs, eggs with higher protein counts, etc. Basic and applied science are each incomplete without the other. Another example of the following of basic and applied science is the study of space and space exploration. Galileo made observations and studied space, ultimately leading to his creation of a telescope that could further reach vision out into the stars, which led to further basic science and further applied science, taking man to the moon. That exploration led to the applied science of providing for provisions and things like that, and space exploration ultimately led to many technological advances in our everyday lives, the everyday lives of most people in Western civilization. This led to greater curiosity and more intrigue about what else is out there. Ultimately, the next step being pursued currently is Mars. This is being pursued through basic and applied sciences while we try to further explore the universe in which we live.